Hi everyone, this Thursday, the 14th of May. Carrying on in John chapter 9, the story of the blind man. Yesterday we looked at the disconnected disciples, the skeptical neighbors, the angry Pharisees, and the cowardly parents. And today we're going to look at the blind man himself. And if we were to describe him, we would say the transformed blind man, because that's really what happened to him. He was transformed in so many ways. This is a man who showed courage and conviction and defended Jesus all the way through and ended up being excommunicated, thrown out, because he never backed down in his support of Jesus. He knew what had happened to him, although he didn't know who had done it. He didn't know anything about Jesus other than his name. And however, by the end, he came to see and to know Jesus personally for who he was. He didn't need, in the end, the synagogue and his religion, because he became a true worshiper who worshipped Jesus in spirit and in truth. From the start, he showed faith in Jesus. Even though we have no record, interestingly, of what he said to Jesus in that exchange when the mud was put on his eyes, he obeyed straight away and went to the pool to wash as Jesus had instructed him to do. We find straight after that he was confronted by his neighbors and then by the Pharisees. He had these series of encounters over several times. And just picture that. Imagine this situation. Here was a poor man who'd been blind all his life. He never knew what it was to see. And he was a beggar. The only way he could make a living was to beg for food. Yet he stood up to them. It wasn't easy in front of a group of stern, important, religious men with a lot of authority who had power over the people. Can you imagine? Suddenly he could see, and here he sees in front of him this panel of judges almost in this tribunal where they're judging him for what has happened and trying to get a version of events out of him that was simply not true. Yet he stood up and he stated the truth over and over again. I think his key statement is in verse 25, where he said, whether he is a sinner or not, talking about Jesus, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. How powerful is that? He was saying, I don't know who he is, but he healed me. He gave me my sight. He opened my eyes. He was throwing in their faces the one thing they didn't want to hear, the one thing they were trying to disprove by all possible means, but could not. That Jesus had opened the eyes of a man who had never been able to see. The most incredible miracle that was undeniable. And in the story of this blind man, this brave man, we see a similar sequence of events, a similar sequence of statements, like the woman at the well that we covered a few days ago. We see a progressive revelation of who Jesus is to him. It's almost the same. In verse 11, Jesus to him is a man. The man they call Jesus, he says, which showed a lack of personal relationship. It was simply some man who'd come into his life and enabled him to see. In verse 17, a prophet. What have you to say about him? The Pharisees said. The man replied, he is a prophet. And then verse 27, a master. He says, do you want to become his disciples too, to the Pharisees? By now he had obviously made a decision. I'm going to follow this guy. He's my master. And yet he still didn't fully understand who Jesus was. And then in verse 33, someone sent by God. He says quite cheekily to the Pharisees, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And he was recognizing Jesus' divine authority, but actually rejecting this imposed authoritarian attitude of the Pharisees, who in a sense were authority over all Jewish religious life. But he was recognizing them and yet throwing in their faces this statement, which they knew themselves, that if a man were not from God, he could do nothing. He certainly couldn't open the eyes of someone born blind. And then, so he was someone sent by God. And then in verses 35 to 38, the Son of Man, a term Jesus used often, meaning God in the flesh, is recognizing his divinity. In these verses, it says, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Incredible, isn't it? And then finally, God who he believed in and worshiped. In verse 38, then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. You only worship God. So there's this beautiful progression of revelation. And that's the blind man. What a character. Finally, let's look at Jesus himself. Now, Jesus healed the man in verse 6 and 7. So we have this start of the chapter with him walking along with his disciples. He has this conversation with his disciples. He looks down at the blind man and he, in compassion, spits on the ground, makes mud, puts it on his eyes in verse 6 and 7. And then Jesus disappears from the story. We don't hear from him again until verse 35. All the rest of it that takes place is with the parents and the neighbors and the blind man and the Pharisees. Jesus is not present, but we hear plenty about him. In fact, it's all about Jesus, and it's all framed in the form of this consistent attack, attempting to discredit him, attempting to disprove it. So the Pharisees themselves start out being divided. Some say that he was a sinner, and others say that no sinner could do this. So there was a small group of dissenters, even among the Pharisees. But thereafter, this small group falls silent, maybe because there were only a few of them, and maybe because they were utterly intimidated by the voice of the overwhelming number. But then they try to say that he wasn't really blind in the first place, and intimating that Jesus was a fake, Jesus was a liar, which is, again, the common thing that we always come back to, Lord, liar, or lunatic. So they're trying to say he's faking it, this is a lie. And then, because they can't prove that it's a lie, they can't disprove the healing, they tell the man to glorify God rather than give glory to Jesus. Basically, accusing Jesus of being a sinner because he worked on the Sabbath. That was the basis of their accusation. It all happened on a Sabbath. And just as a side note, under their hundreds of supplementary little rules concerning life and concerning the Sabbath, kneading dough, or any kind of kneading was considered work on the Sabbath. And interestingly, a commentary says that that's possibly why Jesus healed this way. He didn't simply say, be healed, as he could have done. We know he could have done that. But he made a paste of mud. He kneaded it and made a paste with his saliva and with the dirt from the ground, and made this mud and put it on his eyes. And the thinking is that he possibly did this on purpose to provoke them. And it did provoke them. It drove them crazy. It worked, because Jesus hated the fact that they were externally religious. And this one miracle showed them up for who they truly were behind the mask. And he was unmasking them. And finally, the Pharisees have nowhere left to go with this line of argument. And because the man keeps honoring Jesus in spite of what they're trying to instruct him to do, they start, as it says here, hurling insults at him, and even insulting Jesus, saying, as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from, in a derogatory sense. As for this dude, who knows where he's from? And they end up by throwing the man out of the synagogue. And this is where Jesus comes back into the picture. He finds the man. Obviously, he heard of what had happened. Finds the man and immediately offers him relationship by openly revealing his true identity to him. Typical Jesus. He's open and straight with those who are skeptical and oppose him, and it drives them crazy and they hate him. But he's also open and straight with those who are open to him, and they end up putting their trust in him, believing in him, and following in him, gaining salvation in his name. And so to close, we see here with this blind man a wonderful process that we also see with ourselves. It's a sequence of events initiated and always inspired by Jesus that is a parallel in every one of us today, as we too have a personal encounter with Jesus himself. And this is what happens, and we see it happen with the blind man, and this is what happens with us. Number one, we are all born spiritually blind and are spiritual beggars. Number two, Jesus takes the initiative while we are still in our miserable state and initiates an encounter with us, and perhaps lots of encounters over lots of years that finally result in our salvation. In the process, Jesus does a healing work in us, a work of new creation, opening our eyes and giving us sight, giving us our capacity to truly see. And then fourthly, we have to respond in obedience. Just like the blind man got up and went to the pool when Jesus said, go and wash. We have to respond in obedience. We have to wash in the water, the step of obedience in baptism. Jesus says that we are to be baptized. The Bible says, repent and be baptized. It's an instruction. It's not an option. So we have to obey. Just like the blind man obeyed, he went and he washed. We have to go and wash. We have to be baptized. And in the process, like the blind man, we are changed. People who knew us before notice it and are even confused by it, like his neighbors. They're confused. Yes, it looks like him, and we hear that said because a fundamental transformation takes place in who we are. And following that, we can be persecuted, mocked, belittled, even rejected. But in the process, we have to be consistent and stay loyal to Jesus. And then Jesus reveals himself to us in a personal way, in a personal relationship, and we grow in the knowledge of him. And then finally, we worship him in spirit and in truth. When we come into this relationship with him, when we know who he is, what else is left to do? We worship him as God in spirit and in truth. We know God, and we enter into this relationship with him. Jesus ends this encounter with this statement in verse 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." So he's talking about those who have no knowledge of God will be given sight. They'll be given the ability to see him. But those who claim they can see, those who through religion claim they have all the answers, but actually don't know Jesus, will become blind. Powerful stuff, isn't it? What a wonderful chapter. So tomorrow, let's start a new chapter. We'll look at the encounter between Jesus and a Pharisee named Nicodemus in John chapter 3, verses 1 to 21. So please read it.